Namaste. In my talk, I'll be holding forth on the origins of cultural Marxism and the victimhood narrative. We must understand that there is a malevolent phenomenon called cultural Marxism all around us, and it is a peddler of victimhood narratives. How did it begin? What is it all about? Before I move on to that, let me dwell on the differences between traditional Marxism and cultural Marxism. Traditional Marxism first. Traditional Marxism is best understood as a historical materialism. It is the materialist interpretation of history. And it is also an approach which deals with the totality of human experience, or rather human experiences. A traditional Marxist will deal with the different facets of human societies, human civilizations, such as institutions, literature, the arts, music, etc., as a whole and not in parts. The basis, the foundation of this approach again, is the idea that labor is socially determined. According to Marx, what separated human beings from animals is labor. And in case of human beings, labor is socially mobilized. Or in other words, labor is the manifestation of the social relations of production. The social relations of production in turn give birth to socio-economic formations. A socio-economic formation can be understood as an integrated system which functions according to its own rules, own laws. In Marxist literature, these socio-economic formations are also sometimes termed modes of production. Karl Marx had identified 4 modes of production in human history: the slave mode of production, Asiatic mode of production, the feudal mode of production, and the latest, the final, capitalist mode of production. These modes of production or socio-economic formations do not always necessarily function coherently. There are ruptures within them, there are conflicts within them on account of a class struggle. Class struggle happens when new forces of production emerge within these socio-economic formations and challenge established classes. New classes represent new forces of production and they come to challenge the established classes. A social revolution in the traditional Marxist sense happens when state power is transferred from one class to another, and the relations of production prevalent within the socio-economic formations are completely overhauled. A traditional Marxist aims at this goal. This goal is a revolutionary goal in the eyes of the traditional Marxist. Cultural Marxism, on the other hand, is different. Cultural Marxism can be best understood as a tendency to deconstruct cultures. It is a tendency which reduces cultures, societies, civilizations to their ostensible foundations or basis, ideological foundations. So a cultural Marxist might reduce a typical traditional society, such as our own society, to its ostensible basis. It could be Brahmanism, it could be patriarchy, in order to identify victims. This is the root of this tendency, is the root of all the victimhood narratives, which the cultural Marxist relentlessly perceives and peddles. The root of these narratives are binaries, oppressor-oppressed binaries, which are identified on the basis of the identification of the ostensible ideological foundations, ideological basis of societies. I personally trace the origins of this tendency to the labors undertaken at an institute called the Institute of Social Research at Frankfurt, Germany. This institute was established long ago, nearly 1 century ago, in the year 1923. And some prominent important scholars of the 20th century labored at this institute. To name a few of them, they were Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Jürgen Habermas. Their intentions were supposedly progressive. They sought to understand Western social formations, Western cultural production, and their ideological foundations in order to critique them and generate progressive possibilities within them. Also, their approach was materialist and rather traditionally Marxist in the sense that they tried to arrive at their understandings with reference to capitalism, that is the dominant production regime, production relations prevalent in Europe, prevalent in the Western societies. Today, we see that the cultural Marxist tendency dominates the political left. The political left is much given to identifying oppressor-oppressed binaries on the basis of the perceived ostensible ideological foundations of societies, and it is also much given to advocacy and activism. It is given to advocacy and activism of various kinds of cultural types, generally to the extent that its traditional objectives are forgotten, completely forgotten. Cultural Marxists and their allies in the political left are no more concerned with the proletariat or with orchestrating revolutions anymore. It is to a great extent on account of the political marginality of the traditional left. In India, for example, the formal communist parties such as CPI, CPIM, CPI-ML have nearly zero political traction. They cannot garner any votes. However, this tendency is also account of a certain history, and I'll be recounting this history in my talk. As to how cultural Marxism originated, how the victimhood narratives originated, and how they overwhelmed the political left at a certain point in its history. When we recount this history, we must go back a long time, or rather a long time in the past, about 70 odd years, or a little more than 70 odd years. I will trace the origins of cultural Marxism to the activities, or rather the writings of an individual called Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci lived in Italy and he was a Marxist. However, his problem was that, unfortunately, he lived in Italy and he was a Marxist when the fascists had taken over Italy. So he was jailed on account of being a Marxist in the year 1929. He remained in jail till the year 1935. In these 7 years that he was in jail, he wrote a lot, presumably in order to kill time. He wrote random thoughts. He jotted down random thoughts on a number of topics, on Italian history, on culture, politics, etc., etc. Long after he died, in the 1970s, these thoughts were edited and compiled, and later they were also translated into the English language and published as selections from the prison notebooks. If you read the prison notebooks, it can be a tedious exercise because of the randomness of Gramscian thinking. At a point in it, you will come across a rather strange, curious, and a potentially dangerous idea. You find that Gramsci writes at a point in the prison notebooks that there is a relationship between state ethics. By ethics, he meant culture and morality and the productive forces. Gramsci believed that states enforce a certain level of cultural morality upon their subjects, upon their citizens, in order to support a certain set of or a certain relations of productive forces. What does this mean? To unpack this Gramscian observation, and let me give you an example. Let us say that there is a bourgeois capitalist society with an industrial economy. Now, in the eyes of Gramsci, the state will be enforcing a certain level of culture upon its subjects and citizens in order to support the bourgeois as a class and the industrial economy, that is, the productive forces. That is, the citizens will be imparted a certain level of numeracy and literacy, which are aspects of culture. A certain level of morality will also be inculcated into them. This morality will forbid them from taking what is not their own. That is, this morality will ask them to respect private property. Now, from the Gramscian point of view, this is perhaps a bad thing, because by imparting a certain level of literacy and numeracy to its subjects or citizens, the state will be helping the bourgeoisie, because a certain level of numeracy and literacy is required is necessary for industrial labor, and it is the bourgeoisie who will be owning the industries in such a regime, in such a society. Further, since it is the bourgeoisie who will be owning most of the private property, again, citizens being asked to respect private property will only benefit the bourgeoisie. Moving further on to another step, another stage in the originary process of cultural Marxism, it was a tract written by Max Horkheimer at the Institute for Social Research. He produced this tract in the year 1938. It was titled Traditional and Critical Theory. As the title suggests, in this tract, Max Horkheimer, a learned man, an activist also, tried to draw a distinction between traditional theory and what he termed critical theory. And Professor Horkheimer understood theory in the broadest possible sense. According to him, theory was the production and the application of knowledge. He also argued in this tract that traditional theory is applied in the context of social processes. It also originates and develops in the context of social processes. What did he mean by social processes? I will say, and this is my interpretation of the tract, I'll say that by social processes, Professor Horkheimer understood the processes of industrial production. For example, I'm giving you this example on my part. Let us say, let us take up the theories of iron and steel production, a form of knowledge. Where will this knowledge be applied? It will be applied in the iron and steel industries, which in the eyes of Professor Horkheimer are instances of social processes. So in case of both Antonio Gramsci and Professor Horkheimer, you see that knowledge, culture, morality, ethics, that is, are reduced or deconstructed down to the requirements of the industrial economy. The cultural Marxist tendency had its origins in the 1930s. This is my argument. Moving further on, cultural production too was deconstructed or reduced down to the logic of capitalism by a colleague of Professor Horkheimer. He was Theodor Adorno. In the 1930s again, at a point in the late 1930s, I forget the exact year, probably it was 1938, Professor Adorno wrote a tract. It was called On the Fetish Character in Music and Regression of Listening. In this tract, or in this pamphlet rather, Professor Adorno noticed such certain trends in Western societies as far as musical production and musical reception were concerned. Professor Adorno thought or observed that musical performances or classical musical pieces were being vulgarized to please the average listener. He also thought or observed that music is now only serving as advertisement for piano scores and phonographic records. And he believed that, or he claimed that, like children, listeners were demanding again and again repeatedly the kind of performances or the type of music that had been served to them earlier. He called this regressive listening. That is, the listeners wanted to go back to the stuff that they were familiar with, that they were comfortable with. So here again you see that a certain aspect of Western society, in this case the production of music, a very important aspect of the culture of Western civilization, was being reduced down to the requirements of capitalism. It was all on account of the capitalist economy, all on account of consumption, promoting mass consumption, that music had taken this character. Again in 1948, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno teamed up to produce a book. It was titled Dialectics of Enlightenment. In the Dialectics of Enlightenment, the two professors observed, or rather claimed, that now consumption, the requirements of a capitalist economy, were determining forms of cultural output, such as music, cinema, even advertisement. So, an important step in the evolution of cultural Marxism had been taken. Now, cultural production, forms of cultural production were being reduced down, deconstructed down to the requirements of the capitalist economy. This tendency evolved further with the arrival on the scene of Jürgen Habermas, another Frankfurt scholar. In 1962, Jürgen Habermas produced his most impactful, most popular work. It is still widely quoted, widely referred to. It was titled The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere. In this book, Professor Habermas dwelt upon a significant change that had taken place in the character, in the personality of the public sphere, the informal zone in which citizens interact, debate, discuss opinions, etc., etc. He claimed that a rational public sphere had emerged in the age of Enlightenment and had evolved with the French and the American revolutions. But now the public sphere was media dominated and a site of passive consumption. Moving further on with the originary history of cultural Marxism, it crossed the English Channel in the 1960s while Professor Habermas was producing this study. In 1964, the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies was established in the University of Birmingham. This center is informally known as the Birmingham School, just as the Institute for Social Research at Frankfurt is informally known as the Frankfurt School. The scholars at the Birmingham School arrived at roughly the same conclusions as their colleagues, counterparts in the Frankfurt School. They too argued, like their colleagues or counterparts at the Frankfurt School, that consumerism and capitalism were impacting the production of varieties of culture. However, they did something more and pushed the envelope of cultural Marxism, in my eyes. They argued that cultures constitute identities. Of course, that should be a given to us. But at the same time, they argued that minority cultures resist dominant cultures. That is, minority identities through various means, various forms, resist dominant cultures, or what they perceived to be dominant cultures. So the practice of pitting identity against identity had begun, and this is today a very standard cultural Marxist practice. You will see this all around us. You will see this in our own politics in India. Identities are being pitted by identities, and the theoretical basis of this practice goes back to the 1960s. Meanwhile, as these developments were taking place in European academia, something significant happened in leftist politics. A veritable nuclear device exploded in the year 1956 upon the face of global communism. The 20th Party Congress took place in the Soviet Union, and it was presided over by Khrushchev. In the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev recounted and dwelt on the crimes of Stalin, who by then had become a veritable saint in the eyes of communists all over the world. But as he recounted his crimes, all his cruelties, all the millions of people that he had sent to the gulags or had summarily executed, many communists across the world were left numb and without a moral anchor. Probably perhaps they questioned their own beliefs. In the same year, as the 20th Party Congress happened and all the crimes of Stalin were dwelt upon, recounted by Nikita Khrushchev, an uprising took place in Hungary. It was soon after the 20th Party Congress. The local communist regime, the Hungarian communist regime, lost its legitimacy. It had been established, it had been put in place by Stalin in the wake of the Second World War. But as the crimes, as the various numerous crimes of Stalin came to light, the Hungarian communists lost all legitimacy in the eyes of the Hungarian population, and there was an uprising in the country demanding democracy. Imre Nagy became the Hungarian premier, riding upon the wave of this uprising. However, he could not remain in place. He could not remain the premier very long. The little country was invaded by Soviet forces. Nagy was captured and later executed on charges of treason. Something similar happened again in the year 1968 in Czechoslovakia. In Czechoslovakia too, there was a pro-democracy uprising, a revolt against the communist regime, and a pro-democracy, a pro-reforms regime came to power. It was headed by Alexander Dubček. But once again, little Czechoslovakia was invaded by Soviet Union, and the pro-democracy, pro-reforms government regime was crushed. Rigid communism was put in place again in its place. The crimes, the errors of Soviet communism sent ripples across global communism. The invasion of Hungary especially catalyzed the emergence of a new trend within global communism. Today, we know this trend as the New Left. The New Left was constituted by various kinds of dissidents. A large portion of the New Left came from the student community. Students formed the largest demographic, perhaps, of the New Left. Members of the New Left were not associated with the traditional communist parties. They were also much disgruntled, very disgruntled with Soviet communism. However, at the same time, they were committed to Marxism, and they wanted to bring about a regeneration of world communism. They were committed to this idea. We see that members of the New Left in the 1960s and then again in the 1970s, over the succeeding decades, took to activism and advocacy of various kinds. They campaigned against what they called patriarchy, they campaigned against the traditional nuclear family and gender roles, and they advocated sexual liberation, gay rights, etc., etc. In other words, they took up various kinds of social and cultural causes. I will say that this was an account of the crimes of Soviet communism. Members of the New Left were trying to distance themselves from the crimes, from the errors and cruelties of Soviet communism and taking up these seemingly humane cultural causes. Advocacy culture had had its beginnings in the 1960s and 70s, another important facet of cultural Marxism, along with the practice of pitting identity against identity. Please take note of its progression. While these developments were taking place, while these ripples were running across world communism, important developments were taking place in academia as well. Across the channel, across the English Channel in England, academics took note of what was happening and they came up with a response. Marxist academics took note of what was happening and they came up with their own response. It was in the form of a journal called the New Left Review. The editorial board of the New Left Review became the site of an intense debate, or rather a quarrel between the structural Marxists and the advocates, the votaries of history from below. The structural Marxists were the disciples of a French Marxist philosopher called Louis Althusser. Louis Althusser believed that history is a process without a subject, that it is a process in which actors, individual human actors and their intentions, their agency does not matter. According to Professor Althusser, human beings only passively act out the logic of the production relations or the socio-economic formations which they inhabit. The structural Marxists ran into opposition from a very important British historian and also a member of the editorial board of the New Left. His name was E.P. Thompson. E.P. Thompson was a votary of history from below, or what is termed today Marxist humanism. He gave due importance and due credence to culture as a constituent of class. He produced a monumental study in the year 1968, The Making of the English Working Class, and in this study he gave more than enough importance to culture as something that shaped the psychology of the English working class and made it the working class, the English working class in the true sense. E.P. Thompson absolutely hated the Althusserian position. He believed that human agency counts in history, and he also believed that culture inhabits material relations, interests, and nexi. So culture, in his eyes, was an important facet, was an important aspect of class. In fact, in the year 1978, he produced a tract called The Poverty of Theory, in which he termed Althusser a Stalinist, and his position rank gross Stalinism. He denounced him throughout this tract. Thus, with the arrival on the scene of Marxist humanism and the position taken by Professor E.P. Thompson, Marxism took a pronounced culturalist turn. I'll say that the cultural Marxism was properly born now in the late 1970s, and over the 1980s it has grown and grown. It has three main tendencies which I have touched upon over the course of this talk. The tendencies are to deconstruct cultures down to their perceived ideological bases or the requirements of production regimes, the advocacy of various kinds of rights, minority rights, and the practice of pitting identity under identity. It generates an extremely fragmented or fragmentary view of societies. It also deliberately provokes the conflicts within societies in order to dismantle them. The idea is to dismantle societies and rebuild them in a progressive mold, but it of course does not happen. What happens are conflicts of various kinds. Cultural Marxism is a problem and we have to be aware of it. Thank you.